Hi everyone, thank you for coming. Lauren Belfer was born in Rochester, New York and grew up in Buffalo. She attended the Buffalo Seminary, Swarthmore College, and has an MFA from Columbia University. Her debut novel, City of Light, was a New York Times bestseller and has been translated into 6 languages. Her second novel, A Fierce Radiance, was named a Washington Post Best Novel of 2010 and an NPR Best Mystery of 2010. Belfer's fiction has also been published in the Michigan Quarterly Review, Shenandoah, and Henfield Prize Stories. Her nonfiction has appeared in the New York Times Book Review, the Washington Post Book World, and the Christian Science Monitor, and elsewhere. She lives in New York City. Lauren Belfer.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you all for coming out tonight on, this very difficult evening for weather. So I really appreciate seeing all of you here. Can everyone hear me without the mic? Is it okay? Okay, because I don't want to be imprisoned by the mic, but tell me if you can't hear me. First, I want to give a shout out for this wonderful store. I don't know if all of you know that it's closing in July. It's going to be a terrible loss to the community. So I'm really happy that I could be here to visit this wonderful store again. I was here for A Fierce Radiance, and the store always has a place in my heart. So I want to say a special thanks to Thea and to Andrea and Julia and Alex, of course, for introducing me. And at the beginning, now I want to give my deepest thanks to my live-in research advisor, Michael Morrison, my husband, who's in the audience. When you write historical fiction, having a live-in research advisor is very important. And I dare say I could not have written this book without him. The book is dedicated to him. And after the fire began about 10 years ago, when I received in the mail, at a time when people still use the U.S. mail for announcements, we received an announcement for a class on the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Let's see, there, Bach. At that point, I didn't know very much about Bach's music beyond what I had learned in the piano lessons I'd been forced to take when I was growing up. I don't know if probably some people here in the audience were also forced to take piano lessons when they were growing up. So when I got this announcement, I had a strange hunch that I ought to take this class and that somehow it would turn out to be important to me. I sent in the registration form and the check that very day. And in fact, the class did turn out to be very important to me because that's where I met my husband. But that's another story for another day.
When was it, 10 years ago?
About 10 years ago, yeah.
Wow.
So what I learned in the class surprised me because Bach's music was more magnificent than I had ever imagined. But the sacred music sometimes carried an edge of religious contempt, of lashing out against Catholics, Muslims, and Jews. And that's not a shock, of course, given the era when Bach lived, but it was hard to come to terms with after the Second World War, and also after my own family's history. I had family members who were murdered during the Holocaust. So it was hard for me to reconcile this music that was so astonishingly beautiful with what the music in some cases was actually about. And I had to ask myself, was this exquisite music actually preaching a message of contempt? Well, one evening as I was walking to the subway after class, suddenly out of nowhere, really, this idea came into my head, which was, what if I found a work of art that had been stolen during World War II? And what if this work of art was not a painting, which is what people usually find and what's reported in the news nowadays, but what if it was an unknown masterpiece of music, a cantata by Johann Sebastian Bach? And what if its libretto was, by modern standards, prejudicial and, in a word, horrifying? That was the moment of inspiration for the book that became And After the Fire. I wanted to figure out if great works of art can do harm. And I also wanted to figure out if great works of art, by definition, somehow rise above the context of their creation. But novels, of course, are not treatises, but stories, and I knew I'd have to express my concerns through characters and through people grappling emotionally with real-life issues consuming them from day to day. So I decided to begin the book with the theft of a manuscript by an American soldier in Germany at the end of World War II. And then I shift to present-day America, where a young woman, I called her Susanna Kessler, inherits the manuscript. Susanna has been traumatized by an act of violence on the streets of New York, and her marriage is broken up. Emotionally wounded, struggling to rebuild her life, she's driven to figure out what this strange music manuscript is, and to try to return it to the family that originally owned it. Now, I want to give some examples of what this music manuscript might look like. The manuscript is plausible in every way. My husband is a musicologist, and he kept me to a very high standard of plausibility in the book. So when you read about it in the novel, this is what a Bach manuscript looks like. And you can, it's a little hard to see, I'm sorry, but some things that I want to point out. The initials, JJ at the top, Susanna finds that on her manuscript. The sloppily written J.S. Bach in this corner. You can see here a hole. Bach would correct his manuscripts with a heavy hand. You know, they didn't have erasers the way we do now, so he'd have to rub to make a correction. And often that would actually create a hole in the manuscript. So there's one. And you can see a little bit on this one of the way the ink bleeds through from the opposite side. So you see these shadow notes. I think you see that even better on this example, with these little shadows from what's on the other side. It's iron gall ink, and over time it bleeds through, and this helps scholars to figure out how old a document might be by the degree of this bleeding through of the iron gall ink. Another very touching to me thing that Bach would do, you know, he has to wait to turn the page for the ink to dry. So very often he'd get to the bottom of the page, waiting for it to dry. He doesn't want to lose his thoughts. So he makes these little notes at the bottom to remind him of what he's going to put on the next page. I always found that very touching. So I included that in the fictional manuscript. And you'll also find a lot of discussion about watermarks, because scholars use the watermark in the paper, again, to date the manuscript to a specific time in Bach's life. So here's an example of a watermark, not the one that's in the book, but just so you get a sense of what they look like. And then in this close-up, you can also see a lot of this bleeding through, the Tintenfrost, as they call it in German. So once I had my characters in the contemporary story, and then I had this manuscript, I had my main character, Susanna, begins research into where this could have come from. And her questions about the past led me to discover a really astonishing woman named Sarah Itzig Levy. And here is a portrait of Sarah. She lived in Berlin from the 1760s to the 1850s. So she lived 93 years. And a lifespan like that is an incredible gift to a fiction writer, because I followed her life through almost a century. And you know, she saw astonishing changes in the society around her. So as soon as I learned about her, I knew that I wanted to include her in the book. She was a brilliant harpsichordist, and she studied with the son of Johann Sebastian Bach. Once I discovered her and felt this sort of draw to her, affinity with her, I decided that Bach's son would give her my fictional cantata, and then from her family I could follow the progression of the work through history. So now I want to tell you about Sarah Levy and the world in which she grew up and lived out her many decades. So here's the house where she grew up. One family lived in that house. Now Sarah was one of 15 siblings, so they probably needed the space so that each one could have a bedroom. This is Sarah's father. His name was Daniel Itzig, and he was called the King's Jew. And that's because he was Frederick the Great's banker. He was among the very few Jews in Prussia to be granted full citizenship, and that was for his services to the king. And it's very touching in this portrait. He's wearing Prussian blue, and I don't think that's by chance. The Jews of the Enlightenment in Germany really felt very loyal to their nation. And of course, they had no idea of what would happen 2 centuries hence. There was tremendous anti-Semitism simmering in the culture even then. But he embraced this idea that he was German. I mean, he was the King's Jew. He had done so much for the nation, and I think that's symbolized by the fact that he has his portrait painted wearing the color of Prussia. This is Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach's oldest son and Sarah Levy's teacher. He was a very troubled person. Some scholars have speculated that he may have been bipolar. Of course, that label did not exist in those days. But he went from job to job to job. He could never get along with any of his bosses. He was constantly being fired or quitting in very dramatic fashion. He had an alcohol problem. But he was very gifted, and he adored Sarah. She was his only student in Berlin, and when she got married, he wrote a piece for her wedding. So, as a fiction writer, those are the kinds of clues I look for. When you say, I read letters, of course, but these little things that come up. She was his only student. He wrote a piece for her wedding. I thought, he must have loved her. Now, Sarah, as I said, was a gifted musician. She could not have a public career because she was a woman. But she made her mark on Berlin's cultural life through her musical salon, which endured for over 50 years. The salons of Berlin were different from others during the Enlightenment because they were organized primarily by wealthy Jewish women. And at these salons, Christians and Jews, aristocrats and commoners all mingled freely. This was very rare. This was an era of very strict stratification in society. But for a limited period in Berlin, we had this kind of flowering of different groups of society coming together. Friendships across class and religious backgrounds flourished amid discussions of art, music, and literature. And Sarah was really at the center of this cultural movement. So I want to show you some of her friends who appear in the novel. This was her friend Henrietta Hertz, who also had a salon. They were close from childhood. This is Amalia Beer. For those opera lovers among you, this was the mother of Giacomo Meyerbeer, who was a very popular composer of operas in the 18th and 19th centuries. This is actually how women dressed in those days. Can you imagine how cold they must have been? This is Alexander von Humboldt, who was a renowned naturalist and diplomat. He was a very close friend of Sarah Levy and other members of her family. Sarah had no children, and I sense that this caused her a great deal of anguish, and this is explored in the novel. She was the largest financial supporter of Berlin's Jewish orphanage, and she did much more than supply them with money. She served as what they called an honorary mother. So she befriended the children, many generations of children, and helped to guide their lives and pay for their educations. When she died, she left the bulk of her vast fortune to the orphanage, and that orphanage existed until November of 1942, when the last remaining children were sent to Auschwitz, and the building was taken over by the Hitler Youth. Perhaps because Sarah had no children, she was also close to her niece, Leah Solomon. And here's Leah Solomon. And you can see here the shift between the Enlightenment and the Romantic era, just in terms of the clothing. It's a stylish woman from a wealthy family. This is how she dresses in the Victorian era, in contrast to those really half-naked women we just saw in the last pictures. Leah was also a gifted musician, and she married a man named Abraham Mendelssohn. This is Abraham. He was the son of the philosopher Moses Mendelssohn. And this is the mansion in Berlin where they lived during much of their married life. And this is a very impressive facade, but this really gives you no idea of that an actual estate existed behind this, with a garden of many, many acres, a private garden, and a performance salon that could seat at least 200 people. So they had, must have been fantastic concerts every Sunday, where people would come from all over Europe to attend these concerts with the Royal Orchestra and also with their children, because Leah and Abraham Mendelssohn were the parents of Felix Mendelssohn and Fannie Mendelssohn Hensel. Now, here's Fannie, who's their oldest child. And as I discovered more and more about Fannie and her tragic life, I felt I had to bring her into the novel, and I began to weave her into the story, as you will find. When Fannie was young, she was considered a musical genius. She was a true prodigy. She received a terrific musical education alongside her younger brother, Felix. But when she was a teenager, her father told her that music would never be more than an ornament in her life, decorating her true calling as a wife and mother. So as she grew up, her talents were confined to the private concerts that took place in the family garden. She wrote over 400 compositions, and scholars consider her to be among the most important women composers in the history of Western music. She was also a wife and mother, fulfilling her father's dictum. She married a celebrated artist, William Hensel. And here he is, and he adored her, and this is how he saw her. So she was his muse, and he did dozens of portraits of her looking like this, which even poor Fannie, even her own mother used to say in her letters that she was not an attractive young woman. But clearly her husband, who worshipped her, he saw her like this. It's so wonderful. Now, he was very supportive of his wife's talents as a composer, and he urged her to publish her music from the earliest days of their marriage. But Fannie refused to publish her music because she feared the disapproval of her brother. And this is Felix, her brother. He was world famous in his day. He traveled all across Europe performing his compositions and conducting. So Felix discouraged Fannie from publishing compositions under her own name, but he did publish her compositions under his name. Yes, and there are 6 songs that she wrote that he published under his name. And in fact, he was so famous that he was invited to an audience with Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, because Queen Victoria wanted to perform for Felix her favorite song. And he was ushered into the audience, and Victoria sat at the piano, and she played and sang this song, which Fannie had written, though no one knew. And to his credit, Felix immediately fessed up after the Queen finished her performance, And he said, my sister wrote this song. But the thing is, he wasn't embarrassed or ashamed that the song was published under his name. It was my sense from the accounts I've read and from the letters that circulated among all these people, he seemed to think he was doing his sister a favor, by allowing her work to appear in public. I had to ask myself then, why did Fannie accept this injustice? It's too easy in this case to say that in the 19th century creative women were suppressed, or that, Fannie's reputation would have been destroyed if she had gone forward, or that the family's reputation would have been destroyed. The reason I know that that's not a valid argument is that Fannie's husband, and then also her mother, supported her desire to publish. And surely her husband and her brother and her mother would not have done this if they thought it was going to destroy the family or destroy Fannie's reputation. So this was a really complex issue that captured my imagination, and some of the book is devoted to trying to figure out what was going on in Fannie's mind, because she was making the choice not to move forward. Why was she making this choice? I will let you read the book to figure out why. I won't speculate anymore here. And after the fire took 5 years to research and write. And as always, when I write historical fiction, I sought out letters, diaries, newspaper articles, official documents, because I always want to recapture what people were actually thinking at the time, from day to day as they lived their lives without knowledge of the future. If I just relied on history books written today, I would just find out that, 19th century women were suppressed, end of story. But when I actually read the letters that all these people were sending to one another, you learn a much more complicated story. Now, I made 4 trips to Berlin, 4 trips to Germany to do research for the novel. This is Berlin, very beautiful today. Because of my family's experiences during the Holocaust, I was nervous as I contemplated my first trip to Germany. And yet once I arrived in Berlin, I felt surprisingly at home. Berlin has many memorials to its Jewish citizens, and I think this open recognition of the Nazi era eased my fears and let me experience the city fully. There's a kind of vibrant energy in Berlin that reminds me a lot of New York. Michael and I walked for hours and hours through Berlin's neighborhoods, and I projected myself into the past, looking for clues to the lives of my characters. This is Museum Island in Berlin. So it's here. It's an island where all the major museums exist today. Now, during the Enlightenment, Sarah Levy's home was on what is now Museum Island because it was an area of estates and farms. And Michael and I spent hours roaming Museum Island, trying to piece together from the clues that we had gotten from letters and drawings of where Sarah's estate actually was. Our major clue was that she was a really feisty one, and the king at one point wanted her estate to build one of his new museums. I think there are 6 or 7 museums now on Museum Island. Well, she refused. Even though he offered her a great deal of money to move, she didn't need his money. She was wealthy enough as it was. So she refused to move, and the king was forced to build his museum at an odd angle to accommodate her house and garden. While we were in Berlin, we also visited the Mendelssohn Museum, where I found pictures, documents, and artifacts, letters relating to Leah and Fannie and Felix, and these materials really made the characters come alive for me. Now, here's something very touching I discovered during my research. When the Mendelssohn children were young, they grew up in that private garden behind the family home. They really never left that garden. Private tutors came to them, their music teachers came to them. They lived in this very rarefied and magical world. And they wrote a mock newspaper. And this is a page from their mock newspaper. I mean, first of all, to think that I believe it's 8 issues of this mock newspaper have survived. And you can go to the Berlin State Library and look at them, or you can go online because they were recently digitized, which is where I got this image. And that's an extraordinary thing to think that we can sit, here in this bookstore and look at this mock newspaper that these children made in 1826. You see it says Saturday, the 23rd of September, 1826 is number 7 in their series. It says the house newspaper, formerly the garden newspaper, and Zeitung means, news, the newspaper. So I have to think maybe it was a rainy day or something. So they made this particular issue of their garden newspaper in the house. And the paper had poetry and short stories and political commentary. And it also had drawings and cartoons because Felix was an artist. So I assume that he made this drawing, which is called The Triumph of Chocolate. See, The Triumph of Chocolate. Now, what this drawing has to do with the triumph of chocolate, I don't know. But they seem to think that it did. Now, on that note, speaking of chocolate, I have to confess that one of my most fulfilling and filling discoveries in Germany was this, German desserts. So each afternoon around 4 p.m. after a long day of wandering and doing our research, Michael and I would stop and go to a cafe or a bakery and very carefully choose among the extensive list of offerings. Now, this chocolate cake is supposed to represent, though it does not do justice to, the most extraordinary chocolate cake I enjoyed in Germany, which was a dense chocolate with layers of marzipan. Now this cake only has one layer of marzipan. So the one which was the best cake also had a layer here and a layer here. So I just want you to imagine that because it's quite important in the novel. So I ordered this cake here at Café Raquette in Leipzig. And this happened at 3:35 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. Now my mental image of Café Raquette is that it's hidden at the end of a dark alleyway. It's a secret emporium filled with dozens of varieties of cake and pastry. But Michael wants me to tell you that it's actually quite out in the open and close to Leipzig Central Square and easy to find. Now, judging from this photograph, one might think that Michael is right. But as we all know, pictures do not tell the whole story. So I loved these German desserts so much that I shared them with all my characters in the book, as you will discover. But I saved this cake, the best one, the marzipan and chocolate cake, for Sarah Levy and her great niece, Fannie Mendelssohn Hensel. And I gave it to them in honor of the pivotal roles they play in the novel, and also in honor of my immense respect for them both. Now, and after the fire unfolds across several centuries and on 2 continents, with dual narrations and a broad range of characters and their compelling personal stories, or at least I hope you find that their stories are compelling. It wasn't until I reached the end of the book that I truly understood that what I was writing was one story with many different strands, united through the prism of a problematic artistic masterpiece. All the individuals who come into contact with the masterpiece must try to grasp its history, and by connection, their own histories and the struggles of their own families. My hope in going back and forth in time, as the chapters do begin to alternate back and forth, my hope was that each period would illuminate the other, so that a question that a reader would have in one time period is answered in the next. You have a question in the present, it's answered in the past. Or you have a question in the past, and it's answered in the present. So I hope you enjoy the book, and thank you, all of you, for coming out tonight.
Lauren, how did you come to the title?
Thank you for asking. So if you didn't hear the question, it was, how did I come to the title? So there were two factors that made the title very meaningful for me. The first is that phrase, "and after the fire," is from an oratorio by Felix Mendelsohn called Elijah. And it's Elijah, in turn, is taken from the Old Testament story, the book of Acts.
Kings.
And what?
Kings.
The Book of Kings. Nice. Biblical scholars in the back. Thank you. I have to write that down. And when Felix Mendelssohn died, and so I should tell this very tragic end of the lives of Fannie and Felix Mendelssohn. Fannie, toward the end of her life, began to publish her music. She gathered her courage and stood up to her brother and began to publish her music when she was about 40. And when she was 42, she suddenly died of a stroke. When a member of the family went to see Felix to tell him of his sister's death, he collapsed and he hit his head on the side of a table. People say he was never the same after that. Physicians have speculated that he may have gotten a slow bleed in the brain that just took many months to play out because he died 6 months later. It was also said that he died of a stroke, but nowadays I think it makes sense that he had some kind of slow bleed in the brain from this fall. When he died, his brother Paul, who figures in the book, put this phrase, "and after the fire," onto the coffin, to Felix's coffin when it was taken out of the house. I don't really know why, but when I saw that had been done, it really resonated with me. And then I also started thinking about the fact that another word for the Holocaust, or what that word actually means, is a fire, a great fire, a conflagration. And one of the things I think I'm exploring in the novel is what happens after the fire, what has happened to the third generation now. So I would be considered the third generation. My grandmother was in America during the war, but virtually her entire family left behind in Europe was killed during the war. It was never spoken of in the family. It was the great secret. We all knew it, but it was never to be referred to. And that affected me in very profound ways. And one of the things I explore in the book, because Susanna Kessler has a similar story, our family stories are not the same, but the war was also hidden from her. It was never mentioned. And I found myself thinking about, well, what happens to the third generation then? The generation after the fire, after the great conflagration. And that's what inspired the title.
Thanks.
Yes?
I have a question concerning, you mentioned Leah Solomon.
Yes.
That name sounds different from like most German names. Would it be safe to ask if she came like, say, maybe from a Sephardic Jewish family and married into an Ashkenazic Jewish family?
That's possible, but the Solomons were a prominent German Jewish family. So I don't know what their original origins were, though that's a very interesting question. but as I say, they turn up a lot in that era in German history.
And by the way, happy Mother's Day.
Oh, that's kind of you. Thank you. Yes.
I just have a question about your research. Do you speak and read German fluently, or did you have to work through translators?
So the question is whether I speak German or can read German. I studied German while I was working on the book, but I am not fluent at all. But that, turns me back again to what I said at the beginning, that having a live-in research associate really helps, because Michael is fluent in German. And he, in fact, is a scholar of the work of Johann Sebastian Bach and has written many books about Bach. So everything having to do with music in the novel was inspired by Michael's work. Many of the letters that I read have been translated into English, because Felix Mendelssohn was such an important composer in the 19th century, so incredibly popular, that after his death, many volumes of his letters were published. And so I was able to draw on family letters in English. But then we also read letters in German, and Michael translated them for me. And as I say, this was really important to me for getting a sense of what the people were thinking from day to day, getting beyond history books written now and being able to put myself in their shoes and kind of tease out what they must have been thinking and how they were making their decisions from day to day.
Is Michael either of the two Bach specialists in the book?
No, that's completely fictional in every way. But there's Michael, so you can reach your own conclusions.
Hope not.
Thea, you had a question. Julia, I'm sorry.
I was just wondering if when you were writing, I mean, you may need silence when you're writing, but whether you just listen to lots and lots of Bach, Mendelssohn.
Yes, I really love Baroque music to begin with, and one of the great joys of working on the book was learning so much music by Bach. It was wonderful. I can't listen to Bach while I'm writing, because that's the amazing thing about Bach, is so complicated, and the texture, it's so complex and rich that I find I can't do anything else except listen when that's on. But Vivaldi, Telemann, I would have that kind of playing in the background, and it really enriched my life.
What about Mendelssohn?
It's a terrible thing to say, I don't really like romantic music. So I did listen to the music of Fannie Mendelssohn, because I wanted to know what was her music like. And her music for solo piano is really wonderful. And at the back of And After the Fire, there is a list of recordings of the that I relied on, my favorite recordings of the music I discuss in the novel. And I would urge all of you to listen to the music of Fannie Mendelssohn. She could not write big symphonies because all of her music was performed in a salon. She had to write music that was suitable to the setting where she was working. So these were small pieces. She wrote Lieder. Yes, Michael?
You should explain the Spotify.
Oh, I'm going to.
Okay.
So, you can, if you use Spotify, the music service, there is a link on my website. I put together a playlist of all the important music that's discussed in the novel, and you can access that through my website on Spotify. And much of Fannie's music is there. There's also something wonderful there. Probably most of you know Felix Mendelssohn's piece of Midsummer Night's Dream, the overture to A Midsummer Night's Dream. If you don't sort of know it off the top of your head, when you hear it on Spotify, you will recognize it right away, because it's very popular. Anyway, Felix wrote that when he was a teenager. And one of the early performances, it's speculated, was an arrangement for piano four-hand that he and his sister performed in one of the salon concerts, and there's a scene in the book of them performing it. I mean, he was, 16 years old. he was a very great genius. And at the time, he was considered a greater prodigy than Mozart. And through much of his life, he was called our Mozart, the Mozart of our day. And then in the 1850s, Richard Wagner, who was very jealous of Mendelssohn, wrote a screed called The Jews and Their Music, and he absolutely destroyed Mendelssohn's reputation by saying he was a Jew and saying that Jews could not write good music, basically. And it was almost overnight that Felix went from being our Mozart to being the Jew Mendelssohn, and his reputation never recovered. So, that was a very sobering discovery that I made during the course of my research. Very sad. Yes.
What about George Frederick Handel?
Yes.
Did you like listen to?
Yes, I love the music of Handel, and in fact, my husband wrote a book about Handel's Messiah. So we have a lot of Handel playing in our house. So Handel was a contemporary of Bach's, and a wonderful composer. I should have put Handel in the category of music that I listen to while doing my work, because he too, you can do two things at once, but Bach you never can. I think we probably have time for one more question. Anything else? Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, when you are working on a novel, do you feel that you are discovering a character or constructing a character?
If things are going well, you're discovering the character. And for me, at least, when things are going badly, when I feel as if I'm constructing the character or struggling to get the character working on, and I know things aren't going well. So a novel evolves organically.
Sure.
And so once I get the idea, sort of theoretical idea of what would be an interesting novel, and then I populate it with characters who sort of come into my mind as I go along. And that's why I have to do the research beforehand to get a kind of overview of the time period, as sort of the forest, if you will. And then once I'm conjuring up the characters, they have lives of their own, and I have to do research suited to who they are and discover more and more about them along the way. That's why I say this story about Fannie Mendelssohn. I had no idea about this when I started. But once she was drawn in, because I was writing about Sarah Levy, who then was very close to her niece, Leah Solomon, who then had children. Sarah was close to her children. I got drawn into this story and compelled to explore it. And that's what makes writing a novel really exciting, is that you're always discovering things as you go along.
Well, they're very real.
Well, thank you very much. So thank you all for being here, and I will sign your books.
Thank you.